conversation with Nicodemus, so that's a first this week. Oh, and I do want to mention, so I put it right here so I wouldn't forget. Of course, you probably see these little handy things. I've been making sure to print them just so it is easier to follow, because I do understand that I am sometimes all over the map, and I want to make sure that you're able to follow the outline as we go along. And sometimes it's helpful. You can go back and go, wait, I don't remember what he was talking about right there. So these will provide a nice little outline. As you can see, it's broken into only 2 points today, but we have a few different parts in the second point, and not as many scriptures on the second one there. I had planned and I wanted to read to you a story that I thought was kind of neat, but I'm going to save that to the end. But I think as I got really going this week, I realized how much deeper this subject was really going to be than I thought it was originally. So I'm going to put it at the end, if we can make it there. I'm pretty sure that we will. So if you were hoping to hear the neat little story, you'll have to wait to the end. Hopefully you'll follow us through. And of course, I said we're past on Nicodemus now. We're on to John the Baptist. We're right in the next set of verses. It's verse 22. We're going to go to about verse 30 today. Next week Next week is Palm Sunday. So we're going to look at the triumphal entry and the whole Passion Week there. We may look at glance at Daniel a bit too in doing so. The week after is obviously Easter Sunday, so we'll look at the resurrection. The week after that, we'll come back here and finish up this chapter with John the Baptist. So for today's message, I titled it "A Faithful Man, a Faithful Ministry," because I think in this portion of Scripture we're going to see in a moment, it's really divided up into two major sections, as I said, of the faithfulness of men and the result of a faithful man in ministry. The first, as we discussed, is the events after Nicodemus, moving the narrative along to John the Baptist. And this first portion has to do with John the Baptist's disciples and how they react to a conversation they had with a certain Jew, and their poor attitude, I think, as we'll see, as they're engaged in ministry. The second section focuses 27 through 30, and focuses more on John's response to the disciples, and largely how he remains focused on his mission that God has given him. So let's pick it up in verse 22. We're going to read through 30. After these things, Jesus and his disciples came into the land of Judea, and there he was spending time with them and baptizing. And John was also baptizing in Aenon near Salem, because there was much water there, and the people were coming and were being baptized, for John had not yet been thrown into prison. Therefore there arose a discussion on the part of John's disciples with a Jew about purification. And they came to John and said to him, "Rabbi, who is with you beyond the Jordan, whom you have testified? Behold, he is baptizing, and all are coming to him." And John answered and said, "A man can receive nothing unless it has been given him from heaven. You yourselves are my witnesses that I said, I am not the Christ, but I have been sent ahead of him. And he who has the bride is the bridegroom, but the friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. So this joy of mine has been made full. He must increase, but I must decrease." And what we're seeing here is the success and growth of Jesus' ministry as he moves into Judea after his baptism, and he comes back from the 40 days of wilderness. And it becomes obvious that John's disciples are starting to see that they're forgetting what their mission was. And they're forgetting not only the whole point of John's testimony, which was to tell the nation who Christ was, but they're losing focus on what their part of the ministry was. And their focus was instead on their teacher and on their own self-importance as their efforts in ministry and in their role in God's kingdom. And we often do this ourselves. And Jesus' disciples did this too. You remember in Mark 10, Jesus was talking to them for nearly 34 verses and the Pharisees about divorce. And after some children come up in the picture, he says the first will be last and the last will be first. And he pulls the 12 aside and he's telling them about his death. And this is what they have to say. After all that, he's going through all this teaching. The children come up and he starts demonstrating that we must be humble. And it's not about us. And what do they say? when you come into your kingdom, let me and my brothers sit one on your right and one on the left. Like, you guys didn't just hear me? Where we're going, I'm going to die. I'm not coming back from this trip. And we're always wondering about what God's doing in our lives, aren't we? We're always looking out for number one. And we do know that John's disciples weren't completely self-absorbed. They were, after all, loyal to John and kind of sticking up for him in this case. But much like Jesus' disciples, we can assume that John's disciples also were working in the ministry as well. And we look at, if you can flip over to chapter 4, you'll see in verse 1 and 2, mainly in verse 2 for this point, Jesus wasn't actually baptizing in the river. It was his disciples that were doing that work for him. Likely it was that Jesus was preaching. And we may see that as well. It doesn't say in Scripture, but that may be what's going on here with John. He may be doing the preaching while his disciples are doing the baptizing. So it was the disciples who did the dunking. And why do you think that is? It's an interesting note. Paul addressed this sort of in 1 Corinthians 3. He says, for one says, I am of Paul and I am of Apollos. Well, then what then is Apollos? And what then is Paul? But we're servants through whom you believed, even as the Lord gave opportunity to each one. And can you imagine if people were actually baptized by Jesus? Likely they would have their own denomination today, called the Yeshua Baptist, maybe, trying to walk on water. But notice also in verse 1 of chapter 4, Jesus was making more disciples and baptizing more than John. And so we knew this probably had an effect on them. We know that the conversation after Nicodemus, Jesus' disciples moved in the Judean countryside. So now John and his disciples had to move north. So while they wanted to be in Judea where Jesus was, they're up there in the Samaritan area. So, and they didn't really want to go there. Most Jews avoided that area. So now they've been relegated to move into Samaria. And ever since Jesus overturned the money changers, and his popularity has just grown. And it doesn't help that John keeps saying that Herod has taken a wife illegally, and we know that's not going to go over well, because Herod took his brother's wife, Philip's wife, Herodias, and we know how that ends. But at this time, John is still not in prison. So remember, we just said in chapter 4 that Jesus was making more disciples. But see, the Pharisees also knew this too. And so that means if the Pharisees knew it, then everyone knew it. And it was obvious to John's disciples as well. And it must have been on their minds, because in verse 25, when the Jew began discussing the purification and something that had to do with growing numbers of Jesus, this was their concern when they brought it to John. And it seems they were more focused on the loss of their ministry in defense of their spiritual leader. And we get that. We get the defense of our favorite preachers. We've all done it. I've done it. Especially when I was younger in the faith and when we were spiritual children. And there is a sense where it's commendable to protect, and we see people attack fruitlessly the efforts of men that we know are faithful. But Paul says don't even listen to baseless accusations about 2 or 3 credible witnesses. But it becomes a bit more when we forget the mission and we're protecting someone with wrong motives in our heart. And I want to tell you a quick little story. I remember hearing about an associate pastor who was out of the office one day, and then the staff decided that we were going to move him to a new office. And when they did so, they emptied out his closet, and the closet had a stack of Playboys. He must have been going for a record to collect them. And the staff, they had to fire him. And the senior pastor was told not to say anything to the congregation about it because they wanted to protect him, because the congregation loved him. And so no one knew why he left, the real reason. He went on to another ministry. Meanwhile, the senior pastor took shots to the back for years over this incident. And so it just reminds us that we shouldn't defend someone like that. We don't defend false teachers. I said a couple weeks ago that even I fell into this when I was reading that book, Heaven is for Real. And I would never read a book like that now, because I want to fill my mind with truth. And there are a few teachers that I prefer when I was younger, I don't listen to them anymore. Maybe they're not heretical or nothing like that. Maybe I've just outgrown them, and I still check on them from occasion on time. And we can still love and respect them as we grow, but it's part of the growing. And I'm not saying that John's disciples were falsely converted, but I think they had their theology mixed up with their loyalties. When their minister is more important, something is corrupt, and we need to check ourselves. Now, we don't really know the details of the discussion with the Jew. There is just speculation. Mostly it's just speculation. We do know that the Apostle John, typically when he uses the term Jews, is usually referring to someone in the gospel who is making a gripe against Jesus, usually about some cleansing ritual or something not from the law of Moses, but like a rabbinical tradition. And it was a conversation about purification that directly related to Jesus' growing ministry. So we can kind of take a guess and maybe say that it was just something like, well, maybe John's ministry isn't growing because you guys aren't doing what's right like Jesus is. Maybe that's why he has all those followers. But I want to give you a couple of ideas to look at here about this word, because the word that is used here for discussion is actually zetasis, and it can mean over a matter of controversy or a big debate, strong debate. And it's used 9 times in the New Testament in all 7 verses. I'm going to give you a couple here. Acts 15:2, right here in the bulletin. And when Paul and Barnabas had a great dissension, the brethren determined that Paul and Barnabas had to go up to Jerusalem to the apostles and the elders concerning this issue. So it got to be such a heated thing that they had to go see the elders in Jerusalem. In 2 Timothy 2, Paul says, but refuse foolish arguments and speculations, knowing that they produce quarrels. And then this also in Titus 3:9, and I'm sorry if I'm going a little fast, I just want you to hear them and hear how the word's being used. This is the discussion that they're having. Titus 3:9, but avoid foolish controversies and genealogies and strife and disputes about the law, for they are unprofitable and worthless. So this word is no stranger to arguments. It doesn't mean they were arguing, but we already kind of discussed about what it might look like in a conversation. Now, we don't really know that's what the conversation was, but, we do have some facts about what the word is used and how it was used in the other context. But whatever the issue was, they were armed with this information, and they took it straight to John with their concern, which was what? Look at verse 26. And they came to John and said to him, Rabbi, he who is with you beyond the Jordan, to whom you have testified, behold, he is baptizing, all are coming to him. Notice, all are coming to him. That's their concern. This is self-preservation. The conversation wasn't the problem that they had with the Jew. The problem was brewing within. It wasn't about purification either. It was in the minds and their hearts. They thought they were engaged in their ministry, perhaps because they thought that Rome, their little band was going to grow so big they could overtake Rome and get their freedom back. And we saw this attitude develop with the crowd when they saw what Jesus could do. They didn't need to read the scriptures to verify his authenticity, the crowd. They needed to see his power. So this conversation with the Jew only stirred up what was already boiling to the surface anyway. Their popularity was diminishing. And the people were going to Jesus now, and they knew it. The Pharisees would confirm it soon. And now there was this particular Jew in their camp who was stirring the pudding. And like I said, in a way, we kind of commend them for sticking up for their minister. I heard a preacher say once, he was talking about sticking up for God and defending God. Even a dog barks when his master is threatened. It always stuck with me. And while generally it's not a bad idea, protecting those that we love, but as to what degree, right? And this reminds me of a situation that arose with Moses. And I want you to turn to Numbers 11. We're going to walk through a few examples here. Because if you remember the story, the people were grumbling because they only had manna to eat from heaven every day. And they wanted to eat meat. So they began saying, why did we ever leave Egypt? Well, so the Lord told Moses, go gather 70 men and the elders in the community. Those are trusted men. But let's pick it up here in verse 25. Then the Lord came down in a cloud and spoke to him, and he took of the Spirit who was on him and placed him on the 70 elders. And when the Spirit rested upon them, they prophesied, but they did not do it again. Now notice this. This is where we start seeing a little bit of a difference here. 2 men had remained in the camp, and the name of one was Eldad, and the other was Medad. And the Spirit rested upon them. And now they were among those who had been registered, that means called out, but they had not gone out to the tent. And they prophesied in the camp. So verse 27, so a young man hears and runs and tells Moses, Eldad and Medad are prophesying in the camp. And when he doesn't say nothing, Joshua says, Moses, my Lord, restrain them. But Moses said to them, are you jealous for my sake? Would that all the Lord's people were prophets, that the Lord would put his Spirit upon them. Then Moses returned to the camp, both he and the elders of Israel. It wasn't lost on Moses the motivation of the young man and Joshua. The young man very enthusiastically sought to stir Moses to action. And when he didn't, even Joshua piped up. So sometimes we may not even realize, but we do it too. When we're talking with someone we really respect, we might say things to show our admiration, but we might take it might be a little too far. Sometimes it's more than that, isn't it? Like the way John's disciples bring it up to John. First, they address him with a little flattery, Rabbi, just like Nicodemus did with Jesus. And then also notice, they wouldn't even say his name. We're back in John. They wouldn't even say Jesus. They wouldn't even call Jesus by name. He who is with you beyond the Jordan. This is a subconscious thing. So if they don't say it, they don't think about it, we don't even try to feel it necessarily, it doesn't count, right? That's how we think, it's how our logic is. It's ridiculous. Well, we want to conceal our sin. We hide it even to ourselves. But it always manifests itself in ways that we don't realize, like this. Jesus said, from the heart, the mouth speaks. And we will be held accountable for every word that we speak. And listen to this. I suggest, even for the thoughts that we have, we don't speak, as we conceal our intentions with words that would suggest flattery, but in reality, they harbor wicked thoughts or motives. Proverbs 12:5, the thoughts of the righteous are just, but the counsels of the wicked are deceitful. And Jeremiah 4:14, watch your heart from evil, O Jerusalem, that you might be saved. He's talking to the people of God, not just Gentiles. He's talking to the people of God, that you might be saved. How long will your wicked thoughts lodge within you? This isn't to get down on anyone's case, but look, there's comfort in God's children first, right? Isaiah 55:7 says this, let the wicked forsake his way. Again, talking to God's people. And the unrighteous man his thoughts. And let him return to the Lord, that he will have compassion on him, and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon. Now back in John, the disciples begin acknowledging that they acknowledge him by implication rather than by name. And they say this, to whom you have testified. Basically saying, you gave this guy props and now he's beating us. This is competitive to them. You gave this guy a chance and now he's more popular. And they continue, behold, he is baptizing and all are coming to him. You got to remember, baptizing is not something that was done all the time. We see it now and we're so used to it, and it doesn't even, we're like, oh, okay, someone got baptized. But to see a line of Jews doing it must have been a sight for them. This was a ritual washing, ritual for Gentiles who are trying to convert to Judaism. I mean, they're switching religions. The baptism, or the baptizo, being immersed, was generally about chest deep, and they were dunked from there. And this was so a Gentile could be washed for their uncleanness. Gentiles were considered filthy. So for a Jew to go through this, that meant quite a bit. They're saying, look, I'm as bad as a Gentile, and I know it. So all that to say, this was not something you saw all the time. Lines of Jews waiting to be dunked, confessing themselves as bad as Gentiles. So the fact that Jesus was doing what John was doing, this to them was like, wait, John started this whole deal, didn't he? Isn't Jesus taking a play out of John's playbook here? When in reality, John and Jesus are on the same team. And of course, this is no accident. John's disciples didn't learn this attitude from John. John knew as a small child what his purpose was for. Zacharias, his father, no doubt, raised his boy to know that he was the forerunner to the Messiah. And what a responsibility that was. So this competitiveness did not come from John, and it certainly wasn't fostered by him, and we'll see that later. as he gets on their case about that. Well, he gets on their case, but apparently they missed the entire point of his ministry, as I said before, to point the nation to the Messiah. But John never lost focus. The central problem to his disciples was summed up best by their words, all are coming to him. That's their concern, as we said. And it's not even true, first of all. Not all or everyone was coming to him. And whenever you notice someone say all or everyone, and it's not actually happening, what you're hearing is someone who's got a bent about something. And we cannot have this attitude in our lifestyle. We are called to be sons and daughters of the Most High, right? So now we've kind of taken a look at the errors in his disciples, and maybe ourselves. But I want us to look at the next point, and we're going to move right on into that. And it illustrates a few points about ministry, how to do it properly, and the attitudes that we should have. And while we spent some time looking at his disciples about their reactionary mindset, because they don't seem to have any theological basis for the ground they're standing on. But what I want to do is walk us through the second section to discover the right mindset to ministry. And in doing so, we might even find out how that impacts us personally on an individual basis, walking with God. To do that, I want to look at a couple examples as we move towards that goal. And I think, as I said before, we'll see this develop in 4 small parts. The first is learning rule number 1 in ministry, humility. This is not something you can just say and then you're humble. You can't really say you're humble, can you? I mean, if you try it in a sentence, hi, I'm Jeff, and I'm extremely humble. It doesn't work. I mean, as soon as you say it, you're not. Humility is something that you are. It's a state of mind. It's a state of mind as a Christian with a biblical view that recognizes everything you have is not of yourself. It's from God. In a moment, I want to show you this through a certain man in Scripture. But I want to quickly cement this idea in your minds from 1 Corinthians 4, and I think this verse 7 sets the tone. For who regards you as superior? What do you have that you did not receive? And if you did receive it, why do you boast as if you had not received it? Here Paul is saying, look, what you have is from God. Why are you acting like you got this on your own? And while most of us would not openly admit, some of us think that we are the cat's meow, right? I'm pretty smart. We pulled ourselves up by the bootstraps. I didn't get where I am today by giving up. And there's a certain truth to some of these things. But we have this idea that our capabilities, our physical, our talents, smarts, our charm, our quick wit, our funny abilities, or that we're good looking, or some of us think we're good looking, or maybe some of us think that we know we're good looking. Maybe that's not you. Some of others are withdrawn. And it's not our physical entrapments that snare us, but it's our mental sensibilities. Said another way, some of us are just downright smart. Our ability to grasp certain subjects, topics, our ability to reason and to think. I want to look at one such character who thought that his physical, his mental features, and his accomplishments were reasons for him to be worshipped. If that conjured up someone in your mind and you said Nebuchadnezzar, you'd be right. So let's turn to Daniel 4. Daniel 4, and here in this portion of Scripture, it's written from the perspective of Nebuchadnezzar. He begins by telling his dream to Daniel, who is known for interpreting dreams. We're going to skip around a bit here, so if you're following along, we're just going to kind of hit the highlights. But in Daniel 4, verse 24, this is Daniel giving the interpretation of the dream. Verse 24, this is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king. Verse 25, that you may be driven away from mankind, and your dwelling place be with the beasts of the field, and you be given grass to eat like cattle, and be drenched with the dew of heaven, and 7 periods of time, that's 7 years, will pass over you until you recognize that the Most High is ruler of the realm of mankind and bestows it on whomever he wishes. Skip to verse 27. Therefore, O king, may my advice be pleasing to you. Break away now from your sins by doing righteousness, and from your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, in case there may be a prolonging of your prosperity. Now God gave the king some time to do as Daniel suggested. And even in his reprimanding, God is patient to give opportunity. But notice the typical response of every sinner. He took no action. Took no action for 12 months. He didn't humble himself. He didn't do anything that Daniel said. Remember, he just witnessed not too long ago the 3 boys in the fiery furnace. And then he claimed, oh, there is a God in heaven, right? Daniel's God is the God of everyone. And here we are, just over 12 months later. But listen, the lack of punishment for the sinner is a blanket of peace. And they consider it a blessing on their choices. And this is often the fatal mistake of those rebelling against God. And listen, even those in ministry think that the results of their ministry are the proof in the pudding that they are right and that God is blessing them. The result may be that God allows them to stir in the mire of their own making, but they will not escape accountability. Remember we said a few weeks ago, Hebrews 12, a father chastens those that are his, right? Well, we may want to consider that if we're not receiving any chastening and we know that we're doing wrong, and especially over a length of time, we may not be in his will, and we may not even be saved. Even as ministry leaders, I've heard of many leaders coming to faith years after they have been preaching. Notice the result for Nebuchadnezzar, verse 29. 12 months later, he was walking on the roof of the palace of Babylon. The king reflected and said, "Is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built, as a royal residence by the might of my power?" And notice this is probably what did him in. "For the glory of my majesty?" While the words were in the king's mouth, a voice from heaven said, "King Nebuchadnezzar, to you is declared, sovereignty has been removed from you." Skip to verse 33. Immediately the word concerning Nebuchadnezzar was filled. That's what Daniel had said to him. And he was driven away from mankind and began eating grass like the cattle, and his body was drenched from the dew of heaven until his hair had grown like the eagle's feathers and his nails like the bird's claws. A vivid depiction of God letting us know who's in charge. And unlike Job, who just got an earful for questioning God, this pagan learned a hard lesson from the God of the universe. And you should really read that account sometime. It's really a wonderful lesson to get a full grasp of the king's error. But we need to move along. So the second part of this notion of right thinking about ministry, or even personal right thinking about who we are as members of the body, and I want us to learn that from this example in 2 Chronicles 34. About halfway between Deuteronomy and Psalms. And in there, we're going to read about Josiah. He became king at the age of 8. Now, this is about a man who was actually in ministry and doing good. And we're going to do some skipping around here, but I just want to show you how this man doing good in the sight of God and how that turned out. Verse 1, we see that he was 8 years old. This is chapter 34 of 2 Chronicles. We see that he was 8 years old and he became king. Verse 2 tells us that he did right in the sight of the Lord, which is something that was rare for the kings of Judah. In verse 3, we see him at 16 years old. So 8 years later, he's seeking after God like David was. Verse 4, we see he begins to now not just learn about what's right to God, to do to God or with God, be obedient. Now he starts correcting the ways of worship in the land. And here is a positive note on the minister's role. Because not only do we feed God's sheep, we protect them by tearing down all false forms of worship. That's to include Bible teachers who falsely teach about God. And that's why I say in those comments about other ministries sometimes. I don't always try to name names and that kind of thing, but it just depends on if it's necessary or not. I'm not trying to tear anyone down individually, but their teaching needs to be right. Not to get off on that tangent. But if you're looking for signs of a good minister or a good teaching church, they not only lead you to Christ, notice, but away from what is false. Let's get moving on. So he spends the next 10 years doing this very thing. He's tearing down all false forms of worship. Now in verse 8, he's been in his 18th year of rule. He's now 26 years old. He's had a major revival happening. And during one of these raids and these temple cleansings and all these rebuilding efforts, Hilkiah, the father of Jeremiah, who's written in the Bible, his father, he's a priest, he finds this book. It's the law the book of the law written by Moses. And Hilkiah gave it to one of the king's confidants, who brought it to Josiah and then read it to him. So this confirmed to Josiah that everything that he had been learning and doing over the last 10 years was confirmed true. Now he has the book. He's got the evidence in his hand. God's word tells him. And so what does he do? He tears his clothes, right? And he goes through this whole ordeal about trying to go send someone to go find out. And we want to get God's favor on this thing. We don't want to be we don't want to be in the wrong here. Now let's skip ahead to chapter 35. And all this is happening in the same 18-year reign. This is still the same 18th year. They begin instituting the Passover again. And in verse 18, it says the Passover had not been celebrated like that since the days of Samuel. Around 400 years had passed. And here's where things changed. Notice, he's had great success. The country looks like it's shaping up. Things are looking great. God has spoken favor into Josiah, right? He's been told that he's not going to see the destruction that's coming on Israel. He's going to die, yeah, but he's going to die before all that happens. God doesn't want him to have to bear that burden on his heart of what's coming on Israel. I mean, that's kind of a sad note, but it's a blessing to him nonetheless. This is the greatest year of his reign, restoration of complete ministry. I mean, the celebration of the Passover, the best one in 400 years. And this, in verse 20, after all this, and when Josiah had set the temple in order, Necho, king of Egypt, came to make war at Carchemish on the Euphrates, and Josiah went out to engage him. Now, let me just set your minds right about this. The king of Egypt was taking advantage of an opportunity to take out the Assyrians, who were weak at that time. So he went out to take them and take advantage of that situation and to gain his own access to more territory and whatever. Josiah decided that his favor was pretty top-notch these days. So he went out to meet the king of Egypt while they were on their way, completely unprovoked. The king of Egypt even says, I don't even have a beef with you guys. I don't know what this is about. Look at verse 21. But King Necho sent messengers to him saying, what do we have to do with each other, O king of Judah? I am not coming against you today, but against the house with which I am at war. And God has ordered me to hurry. So stop for your own sake from interfering with God, who is with me, so that he will not destroy you. He's telling the king of Israel this, or the king of Judah. And here Josiah makes a fatal mistake. He forgot rule number 1 of ministry, humility. And look, others may be hearing from God too. I said a couple weeks ago about me and my wife, and maybe she hears maybe she feels that God's leading her one way, and I feel God's leading me another way. If there's something wrong there, we need to stop and check it out. This would have been great advice for Josiah, but he didn't do that. Look at verse 22. However, Josiah would not turn away from him, but he disguised himself in order to make war with him. So look, if you're on him, you think you're doing right and you're in God's will, and you feel a little pushback, it's probably best to not just push through that. I think God really wants me to have this, or God wants me to do this. You feel a little pushback, then maybe God telling you to back off. And especially if you have to go around and be sneaky about it. And you maybe go around and don't tell someone else what you're doing, or the person that you're having the issue with. Look at what he says. But he disguised himself in order to make war with him, nor did he listen to the words of Necho from the mouth of God, but came to make war in the plains of Megiddo. And listen to verse 23. The archers shot King Josiah, and the king said to his servants, take me away, for I am badly wounded. Bad idea, foolish idea. It cost him his life. And listen, this was not God's idea. This was a self-motivated idea. He was acting in the flesh, operating on a human level, not from the Spirit. And we as ministers of the gospel need to make sure that we are not operating in the same way. I truly believe this is one of the largest problems in the church today, the visible church that we've talked about. Many preachers and so-called ministers operating on their own desires. And this is exactly what John's disciples are doing. But notice, this is not what John is doing. Back in John 3, John's still practicing the first rule of ministry. Verse 27, he says, a man can receive nothing unless it has been given from him from heaven, And notice his focus to remain faithful to his mandate. Verse 28, You yourselves are my witnesses that I said, I am not the Christ, but I have been sent ahead of him. Notice he's quoting himself from the past. He's remaining steadfast on his mission. He's not drawn off task by popularity or influence. And notice this, lack of popularity or influence. Because oftentimes a lack of that influence or popularity may motivate you to try and grow your ministry more. But he didn't do that. Like Jeremiah, who served God for 40 years, he never saw a single convert, but he remained on task. That's the mandate to the call of the ministry. And even in myself, I'm not just pointing this at you guys, I caught myself praying this week for growing the ministry. This aims right at my heart. The point is very sharp, and I take it seriously, and I thank God that he sets me straight, especially when I'm wrong. The responsibility is so high. Sharing the gospel to the world is the greatest call for any minister, especially for pastors. But remember, it's not about me. It's not about pastors of ministries or churches. That's why, if you ever have a chance, the opportunity, in my office, I have little clay pots, and I made a collection of them. Because I'm just a broken, ugly little clay pot that carries such a big message. This is the message of the King. I referenced a story a few weeks ago about a church in Los Angeles, and the media dubbed them the Church of 900 Ministers. The 900 was their group, their membership size at that time. And the news is commenting, the entire congregation were all like ministers. And that's what I pray for here. That we would be known in the community as ministers of the gospel. Ministers who serve the world and the community around us. And this leads us into the third part of this thing. The right ministry and personal growth, personal level for the growth. And that comes from men and women who are of immense responsibility. Look at verse 29. The bridegroom is number one man. We call this man the best man. John simply says he is the friend of the bridegroom. And that's just not anyone that's available, like, hey, Johnny couldn't make it, so I showed up. This is not that. The friend of the groom was, I'd say, the most trusted man in the whole ordeal. We mentioned in our study of Luke a few weeks ago, the bridegroom spends a year preparing his home for his new bride. And that may include, building up the farm, or they're an agricultural society, and he's got a wife coming soon, and a family. So they got to build this thing up, and the friend likely helped with that process. But more than that, the friend of the bridegroom was the liaison between the bride and the bridegroom. He might even spend some of his time, the friend, with the bride, helping her with some of their needs of preparation. So this was a really trusted guy for a year or more. I don't think I would trust anyone with my bride for a year. I don't want that kind of relationship, developing over the time. But this guy was really trusted. So this really shows you what the responsibility level is for John here as the forerunner to Christ. And he served as an attendant to the groom and the bride. The bride likely had her own attendant. It is said that Elijah was the Messiah's attendant. And here we see John the Baptist as one representing like Elijah, attending to the groom's needs. And it was said that Moses being the bride's attendant, because it was Moses who brought the people to God for the covenant. Much like a bride's attendant leads the bride to her groom. Notice verse 29, he's saying, the friend of the bridegroom, he stands and he hears and rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. And it was an ancient Jewish custom, the bridegroom and the bride would enter the chuppah. It's a Jewish name for the room that was added on to the father's house for the groom and the bride. And the ceremony was complete. The bride and the bridegroom would go into the chuppah for 7 days. And the groom's attendant would stand outside and he would wait to hear the knock from the inside of the room so that he could announce the bride and the groom, because the party had been happening all week. Like Moses in Matthew 17, we picture the glorified Messiah with Moses and Elijah. And that picture is of the awesome responsibility of the groomsmen. And this is what we are called as ministers to be. And that responsibility is high and the calling is serious. And I think that we are all ministers. And this is why James tells us, he warns us, let not many of you become teachers, my brother, knowing that as such we will incur stricter judgment. John finishes his testimony of a job completed when he says this, So this joy of mine has been made full. And we're almost done. But I hope his use of past tense wasn't lost on his disciples. Has been made full, meaning mission completed. He had done as he had been mandated to call or called to do. He was faithful to complete his task. And I pray that we could all be that, faithful as John. Faithful to our calling, faithful to call sinners to face God head on. And when reality comes, we don't back down to sinners. We call them to come face to face with Christ, who loved them enough to lay down his life. And that it is Christ who is the focal point of our ministry, not some earthly gain. Like John, this is where we find our joy, well beneath the rapid, raging current of emotion and serious, hard trials. This brings us to our final point. I'm just going to mention it in passing because we've pretty much hit it the whole way. He must increase and I must decrease. Here John affirms the message that we've been talking about. In case anyone missed it the entire time, and if his disciples missed it, they thought that maybe their thing was going to catch on. It was made clear right now, and he couldn't say it any clearer. He must increase, I must decrease. He squashed all that right there. One more quick little thing. I told someone about being a Dollar General store manager for a while, and while I was waiting for my own store, I was at another store helping other managers, and many people knew that I had the authority and I didn't need to have things checked like another manager. I had the authority. I didn't have to get approval on certain things, and many people tried to get me to use this power to their advantage because they didn't like some of the rules their manager instituted. I had to let them know right then and there, I was not at this store to do that. I will not act over my authority with this other current manager. And I think that's necessary to say because John recognized his responsibility to squash any rebellion against the bridegroom. And he did so without hesitation. We don't make this up as we go. We follow the prescribed path given to us. And much like our church, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We don't need fancy gimmicks to pull in the community. Yeah, we support the community. We're there for them. We serve them. There's nothing wrong with doing that. There's nothing wrong with updating the facility and things like that. I mean, that's not what I'm talking about. But I saw a church that had a series on Jesus Take the Wheel. It's a secular song. And they had car parts all over the stage. Completely unnecessary. I won't be doing sermons based on secular songs. I won't be decorating the stage like Barnum and Bailey Circus. You guys come here for the word, and that's what you get. As one preacher put it, I'm just a talking head up here. That's it. Well, in just a moment, we're going to conclude. And I'm going to read you that story I promised, because it's pretty interesting. I've always loved it. As soon as I heard it, I just never left my memory. But I did write it down so I wouldn't forget little details. But if you have something on your heart, we're going to play the invitation music in a little while. I would ask you that you come up and pray to the Lord about these burdens. If you want to come talk to one of us in the church or me about anything that we've talked about today, something maybe on your heart, maybe you're on the fence, you've been sitting on the fence for a while, I'd love to have that conversation with you. Or if you want to talk about a believer's baptism, we would love to have that conversation as well. Or maybe membership in the church. You can do that during the song, or even at the end of service. Sometimes people don't want to walk down the aisle when everyone's looking. That's fine. But don't hesitate to come. So let's close with the little story. On a dangerous sea coast where shipwrecks often occur, there was once a crude little life-saving station. The building was just a hut, and there was only one little boat. But the few devoted members kept a constant watch over the sea. And with no thought for themselves, they would go out day and night, tirelessly searching for the lost. Many lives were saved in this wonderful little station, and so it became famous. Some of those who were saved, and others around the area, they wanted to become associated with the station too. So they would give their time and their money and their effort to support this little station. And new boats were bought and crews were trained, and the life-saving station grew. Some of the new members thought that the building was crude and poorly equipped. So they felt that a more comfortable place should be provided for those that are just being rescued from the sea. This should be their first place of refuge should be nice. So they replaced the emergency cots with beds, and they put in better furniture, and they enlarged the building. Now the life-saving station became a popular gathering place, and they really decorated it beautifully and furnished it as a sort of club. Less of the members were now interested in going on the life-saving mission, so they hired lifeboat crews to go do the work. The mission of the life-saving station was still given lip service, but mostly they were too busy to go out and do the activities themselves. And about this time, a large ship was wrecked off the coast, and the hired crews brought in loads of cold and wet and half-drowned people. And they were dirty, they were sick, and some of them spoke strange languages. And the beautiful new club was considerably messed up. So the property committee immediately had a shower house built outside the club where the victims of the shipwreck could be cleaned up before coming inside. And at the next meeting, there was a split in club membership. Most of the members wanted to stop the club's life-saving activities as being unpleasant and a hindrance to their normal life in the club. Other members insisted that life-saving was their primary purpose. And they even pointed out, we're actually still called the life-saving station. But they were finally voted down, and they were told that if they wanted to do the activities of life-saving and all the various kinds of people, then they could do that on their own and make their own life-saving station down the coast. And they did. And as the years went by, the new station experienced all the same changes that occurred in the old. And they evolved a new club, and yet another life-saving station was founded. And if you visit the seacoast today, you will find a number of exclusive clubs along that shore. The shipwrecks are still frequent in those waters, only now most people drown. Let's pray.